So what I like to do now, is it running? So what I like to do now is to present to you the next assignment. It's going to be a team assignment, like the first one. So you don't have to suffer by yourself, you can suffer. Just remember that misery loves company, so there's no point in being miserable by yourself when you can be with other people that are just as miserable. And what it is going to be an application of the Taylor rule. And so I'm going to show you what the assignment is, and then we go about. Okay, so all of this is in black. All of this is in the Blackboard folder called Taylor rule. Okay, so what I want is for you to examine the sensitivity of the prediction for the federal funds rate using the Taylor rule. Taylor rule is already in place for 2015. And so we're going to make a forecast for what the interest rate in 2015 should be using the Taylor rule. And we want to see the sensitivity of that forecast to three things. Are we okay over there, Vivian? Okay, good. The first thing that we're going to do is to see the sensitivity to the choice of data vintage. I haven't said a word about data vintage. It's probably one of the most important things in applied macroeconomics. So we're going to see that in just a second. And the Excel file that I provided, it has two vintages, 2014 and 2012. Then the next thing we're going to do is to examine the sensitivity of the forecast for the interest rate to changes in the parameter for inflation target. We're going to say no inflation targeting or 0.5. And then we're going to have changes in the parameter for persistence between 0.5 and 1. So one of them is the weighted average between history and the Taylor rule is 0.5 or 1. The relevant Excel file is in Blackboard on that. So that's the assignment. What I want you to do is to devote just one page to show the sensitivity results and to use that sensitivity analysis to make a comment on the current debate in the United States to legislate the Taylor rule as the way to go for the central bank. I put the debate also in Blackboard. So if you go there, you're gonna start by saying you're gonna hear the testimony of John Taylor in favor of the Taylor rule, and then right after that is the comment by Martin Feldstein, also explicitly saying that maybe that's not the way to go. And so what I want is for you to make comments on those positions, not so much by appealing to enlightening principles, but appealing by the sensitivity of the results of the Taylor rule to changes in the data vintage and to changes in the parameter. What I want is a one page that indicates the nature of the debate. This is about 3 sentences, no more than, or 3 bullet points, no more than that. And you're gonna show me a table that has the sensitivity results. There's no need for charts and charts and charts and explanations for those charts as well. It's just one table, and it's gonna be about maybe, let's just call it 10 rows by 4 or 5 columns, no more than that. So it's a small table. And then underneath that, you're going to indicate to me what's your take on that debate. Okay? So it is truly, I mean, I want some structure on this, and I think this is for all I know. This is the structure that you're gonna be, or that you have followed, or that you'll be following in your professional life. So it's we don't want elaborations and explanations. Okay? So what I'm going to do now is, Pete, you have a question?
Just so you want the nature of the debate, results, the table, and comment all on one page.
Literally. So it's going to be a small font, right? in kind of a narrow margins, but but in the bullet points that have more than 2 lines start defeating the purpose of the bullet point. So the debate is, John Taylor argues that Federal Reserve should follow this legislatively. In other words, not when they think it's good or when they think it's, but they should follow this as a matter of the law. Feldstein doesn't quite see it that way. So that's the debate. It's 2 bullet points. Then what you're going to do is say, I'm going to examine this using the Taylor rule. And here it is. I'm going to examine the sensitivity of a Taylor rule to data vintages and to parameter values. You don't have to go and make a derivation for the Taylor rule, but you got to put it in the 1 page. Just write the equation. Assume that I know it. Okay? Then, underneath that, you park the table of results. I will give you some hints on how I would do it. And then, when you tell me, based on this sensitivity, Taylor is completely crazy, based on this sensitivity, we should not wait 1 more second in implementing Taylor. Okay. And the next thing that I want to do is let me take you to, this is going to be a little important, but let's just, there's a website called the IMF has something called the World Economic Outlook. The World Economic Outlook has a database that I think you will find very helpful in whatever line of work you are, unless you go and start doing, paralegal or paramedical, or you ditch this line of work and you say, well, that database is not helpful. What I like about it is 2 things. The first one is the country coverage is amazing. The second thing that I like is that they have what I call vintages. So they're going to tell you the data that they have. The data that they published in, say, 1996. So they have that data. So there will be a database there for their values and their forecasts as of 1996. Then they're going to, they also did it in 1997, 98, 99. And so you can see how the views of the IMF have changed over the years, because they're not replacing the values with new ones. They have vintages. And so what I did, I went and I got data for the United States for the vintage of April 2014 and from the vintage of April 2012. Okay? And let me show you, let me start with the inflation rate. And so this is the evolution of the inflation rate for those 2 vintages. The solid line is the data from the IMF as of April 2014, and the one with the dashes is the one for April of 2012. What you see here is the forecast revision of the IMF. So in 2012, the IMF was effectively assuming that let me see, put the numbers in here? Yeah, so in 2014, the IMF was forecasting for the United States an inflation rate of 1.8. And then, as time went on, they were forecasting in 2014, same year, an inflation rate of 1.4. So how will you interpret this downward revision of the forecast? Alexander, how would you interpret it? Or what do you think will give rise to a downward revision of the forecast, on the IMF forecast for inflation?
All the preceding events that weren't taken into account the first time they did it?
Yes, right. And what I'm asking is, what are those events?
Well, since it's inflation, possibly slower than expected economic growth.
Perfect. Right. And so, in 2012, the IMF thought that the recovery in the United States was going to take a particular pace that was going to result in an inflation rate of about 2. 2 years later, they don't quite see it. And so the advantage of this, the IMF, is that they're showing you not only the different vintages, they're showing you the forecast for each of those vintages. And so we're gonna use those forecasts for evaluating the role of vintages in the forecast. Now, this is probably as nice a diagram as the IMF can put together. And that's because the CPI inflation rate are not revised. Let me show you the ones that are a little more annoying. This is, let me see if I can make this a little smaller. This will involve the display of my ignorance to a degree. No, that's ignorance, and I'm just not gonna show it anymore. So here it is, what the IMF call the output gap. So this is the gap between actual output and a measure of potential output as a ratio. So when that ratio equals 1, output, current output equals potential. If the ratio is above 1, then we're growing above potential, and if the ratio is below 1, we're below potential. In 2012, what you're not gonna like about this is that we're revising history, okay? So the IMF in 2012 thought of the output gap in the United States being positive 4, so that the United States was expanding at a fairly rapid pace in the year 2000. This is their view from the vantage point of 2012. 2014 comes in, and the same question is asked. What was the output gap in the United States in 2000? Not in 2013, in 2000. And this is what we have. So they cut it, right? This is annoying, right? Because we're revising history. And revising history is a long way of saying we don't know where we are. Because if they revise the history, why would I trust the values that they report today? Because today is gonna be history in a couple of years. That history will be revised. So why would I believe, how do I know where I'm standing? You see the tension that these revisions create, and there's just no way around it. You would think that by the year 2014 that we would have settled on what happened in 2000. Maybe there was a little gap in here, maybe the new data comes in, there's some new estimation method. But man, this is not negligible. This is big time. Okay, we're gonna call that Exhibit A. Exhibit B is that the same tension applies to their forecasts for potential output. So in 2012, this is what they were forecasting for output gap, and this is what they're forecasting now for the output gap. And so in the eyes of the IMF, and this is the point that Alexander was making, in the eyes of the IMF, the United States was going to be back to equilibrium around 2016. They have revised their view since then, and now the United States is going to be, according to their views, in equilibrium. By equilibrium meaning output equals potential in 2018. Okay? All right. What we are going now to do is to examine how these differences affect forecasts for the interest rate. Right? Because there's a world difference saying that we are in equilibrium in this day and we are below equilibrium for the same day. And to the extent that we're revising our forecast, and to the extent that we're using a forward-looking Taylor rule, we're now revising one hypothesis. All right.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
For the revision of like what the gap is in 2000 from 2012, what changed? Like what were they looking at that changed so drastically to drop the forecast in 2014 to 2012?
The answer is I don't know. The subsequent answer is I will go there in just a second to do it. unfortunately, the IMF does, or at least I haven't seen a document where they clearly laid out how they compute potential GDP. Okay, and so without that, all right, so I want you to imagine that this is a collection of observations on GDP. And then he says, how do I compute potential given these observations? So one method that people use is to put a trend. And so then this becomes potential outcome. I want to call this 2012. And I want to call that 2000. Now more data becomes available. I'm exaggerating for the purposes of and we do then the same trend calculations. Now, this is the new trend for 2014 data. And you can see that the old gap between actual and trend is now different. So you can imagine that this was above trend. Now it's below trend. And it is only because the same method is being applied to the addition of data. So that's one possibility. The other possibility, I'm going to erase this, the other possibility is that it has to do with measurement. Measurement methodologies. Okay? What this means is that in 2012, I'm going to talk about in general terms. In 2012, there were methodology, let me call it methodology 1. I will be more precise in just a second. And in 2014, there were a new methods, new series of methods to measure the same data. And so when you apply M2 to history, it gives rise to a gap. Okay? What could the difference between M1 and M2 be? Well, one possibility is this happened in the United States. One possibility is the use of redefinitions of should you include software development in investment. So this happened in the United States. So software was not part of the investment, so it's part of nothing. You know? So now it is. So that then will affect the measurement of GDP. And so when you say from here on out, we're going to be including software development in GDP, and we recompute history. Now we have to go and revise history. Now comes the trick. The trick is, well, what's the real value of investment software? Well, talk about devoting a career to a question. So the guys in the Bureau of Economic Analysis do this for a living. And so what's the real value? Think about how much would I be willing to pay to have an iPhone 10 years ago with the functionality that it has today. The iPhones are now packing considerably more computing power than IBM's of 20 years ago. Which means that when we measure the real value of an iPhone, we need to say, how much would I be willing to pay to have access to the internet, forget the phone part, access to the internet 10 years ago? How much would that be? A lot. Well, then when you adopt that methodology and then you go back in history. Well, to have an iPhone in 2000, well, forget that. That would have been, it would have been it. Little it. What would you do with that iPhone in 2000? Not much, because there was nothing else that you could do, I mean, other than calling your friends. But Facebook, forget that. And so, what is getting in the way of getting precise numbers on, one of the reasons why it is difficult to get precise numbers is because technology is changing. And the provision of technology is about the provision of services, and we don't know how to measure the real value. So we have to make up a methodology. And when we apply a new methodology backwards in time, that affects what we call real GDP in 2000. And so it's a mixture, right, between those two things. Right? Any other questions on this? Okay. So let's go to the Taylor rule. So this is what I did. I downloaded the data from the IMF. Just allow me to be a little less vague. I know this sounds like I'm now doing a cooking class in TV, but damn near, right? So this is the item that I recommend. The World Economic Outlook. It is a really important. Think of this as it is published twice a year, and it embodies what, in the eyes of the IMF, are the more important issues, and from our standpoint, the database. And so here is the archive of the world databases, right? And so look, these are, for each year there are going to be 2 of them, and this is what I'm calling vintages. So you want to know what was going on, how the IMF viewed forecasts in 1999. It's right here. Click and find out. All right. And so what I did, I went to this database, and then I clicked on this, and I took advanced economies, clear all, pick the United States. Right? You don't have to. You pick the series that you want. Output gap, inflation rate. And it's just gonna do this. Prepare a report. See you later. That's it. We're done. Now, if you wanted then to save it into an Excel file, you click in here and it opens up as an Excel file. So that's what I did in here. So I went there and said, the IMF's WEOR for 2014. So I have the output gap, the inflation rate. I also put the unemployment rate, so in case you want to comment on the assignment using the unemployment rate. This column here is the Taylor rule. I haven't shown you how I'm doing that just yet. And this is the actual federal funds rate. And the coefficients are right here. Okay? And in here are the same calculations using the April 2012 vintage. Okay, so let's go to the Taylor rule. I'm going to be using the Taylor rule with persistence, which is another way of saying at one point or another I need to have an initial condition. And so the initial condition that I'm using is the historical value for the federal funds rate, which is this. So these 2 values are the same. The next thing that I do, let's go with this. So this is 1 minus J3, and J3 is the persistence. Right? And so 1 minus J3 times the entirety of the Taylor rule. Right? Notice that this E5, E5 is the actual inflation rate, K3 is the real rate that I made at the assumption, plus I3 three, which is the inflation coefficient. So it's E5 minus the target of 2 rate, plus 1 minus the inflation coefficient times the output gap. So I don't have to be dealing with the growth rate and the growth rate of potential. I'm now dealing with the output gap. So that is a stand-in for that difference. And you just go. I'm sorry, plus J3, which is the persistence, times G4, which is the Taylor rule, the interest rate in the previous period. So you just go, and you drag down, and there is your Taylor rule. It is as simple as you can make it. It is forward-looking, it has persistence, it is intuitive, and so you can see why people gravitate towards the use of this, okay? I'm using the inflation coefficient, I'm setting these coefficients the same to each other, okay? This shaded area here is the forecasts. So the IMF is forecasting for 2014 these variables, and therefore these are the forecasts that of the interest rate if it were to follow the Taylor rule with the assumptions that I made. And what I'm asking you is to examine the sensitivity. What I'm asking you is to examine the sensitivity of the forecast for 2015 to changes in these parameters and to changes in here. So that you can see, right? It's the same, yeah. So in 2015, if I were using the Taylor rule with the IMF data, I would be forecasting a federal funds rate of, I'm sorry, so I was clicking the wrong thing. No, I click on the right thing. We'll be forecasting a Taylor rule of 2.2. New data comes in, and I'm now forecasting a federal funds rate of 1.9. So right there, 0.25 owes to a different vintage. 25 basis points in interest rates is huge. 25 basis points is the sort of thing that makes it a headline item, okay? And so what I'm asking you to do is to go and change these parameters, right? That and that, that and that. And what you're going to then generate is a collection of results. And so here's what I suggest. Let's put inflation parameter. Way to go. What is the looking thing? Oh, this guy still have
Plus,
what I'm gonna put here, persistence. And so what are the possible values? 0.5. 0. Oh, wait. Oh, I know what the problem is. And we're gonna put here 0.5. Let's just do, I'm sorry, it's just 2 cases only. You put here April 2014, April 2012. Okay? So you're going to be putting here the interest rate forecast under this configuration parameter. So this will be 1.9, and here will be 2.15. And then you're going to be doing the same calculations and generating the other values. what I hope you will find is that there is enough variability in that forecast interest rate to, you know, to make a guess at, well, how do we know that we got the right Taylor rule? How do we know that we have the right forecast? And if we don't have unambiguous answers to these two questions, then why are we going to insist on something that is so sensitive? Okay? All right, so notice that this table is this table is not that big. I mean, it's gonna be a header, right? It's not that big of a table, so it fits in the middle of it. Then underneath of it, you're just gonna put your observations. It's a team affair, so you don't have to suffer too much. And what I'm ultimately want from you, it isn't so much that it depends, or that we have to do further studies, or that this. I want an unambiguous view. This is not an exam where there's a right answer or a wrong answer. What I want is for you to say, based on what I have done, Congress should adopt the Taylor rule, should not adopt the Taylor rule. I don't want to hear things like, well, it's a dangerous proposition, so we have to study more. Right? We don't want that. We don't want delays. We don't want, when I grow up, I want to be that. No, it's now. I want to see your take. What we're ultimately after is the extent to which you are persuasive. If you start hedging the conclusion, you stop being persuasive. Okay? You could be persuasive by saying, I think we should not adopt the Taylor rule. There is, however, a couple of benefits or merits, so you start hedging that way. But the first bullet point is your view. Don't tell me when I was little. Okay, and so this is due next Thursday. It should not be all that time consuming. There are a couple of things that I want you to somehow appreciate or come to grips. First, we don't know where we are. That's to me the main message of vintages. If we can revise GDP output gaps in 2000 by that magnitude, how do I know that, how can I trust the numbers that I'm using today? Answer, I can't. So, you know, not quite a fly-by-night operation, but it is close. All right. Any questions on this assignment? All right, so let's go now and deal with the Bank of England report. Okay. The reason why I'm trying to bring out or make several remarks about the Bank of England is because, in my mind, they are the gold standard of communication strategy, especially when you have inflation. Okay, the way they do it, their approach, it's just something else. Okay, and in particular, there's something called the inflation report. If you go to the Bank of England's website, there's something called the inflation report, and the inflation report does the following. It's going to show you confidence bands for inflation forecast and inflation target. It's not going to just show you the forecast. It's going to show you a confidence band. We anticipate that, we'll go like this, we anticipate that the inflation forecast, the forecast for in the year 2016 will be between 2 and 1.5. They're not nailing it. They're saying there's a 95% confidence band that the inflation rate will be there. Hopefully that will include the target. They also show confidence band for alpha. So the Bank of England is not in what some people will characterize a strict inflation target, because they care a lot about what happens to alpha. And then they indicate the measures they're going to take when to correct deviations of inflation from the target. So they show you the outlook for inflation, the confidence band, they show you the outlook for GDP, and whenever there's a gap, they provide an explanation for why there's a gap and what they're going to do about it. You can imagine, for instance, that if there is a period, if there's a time when oil prices increase a lot, that there will be a spike in the inflation rate. And so what that doesn't necessarily trigger a correction on the part of the central bank. Because if they persuasively identify that the reason for the spike in inflation rate is something that is transitory, then they say, yes, we are above target. But it's the sort of thing that we anticipate will be eliminated in 2 years all by its little self. Right? Or if there is a strike, and that strike raises the prices of products in that particular quarter, then there's going to be a corresponding increase in the prices. So the inflation rate will be above the target, but the strike was just, if they anticipate the strike being resolved, then they will then be saying the inflation rate will come back. And so there's going to be a fair amount of analysis on the part of the Bank of England trying to determine the extent to which the factors for a deviation are transitory or not transitory. What's the big deal? Is that those confidence bands are not based on the standard errors that you get in statistics. Those confidence bands are subjective. You say, how is that possible? That is part of the magic of the Bank of England. What is the probability that there's going to be an increase in the price of oil about, let's do it now. There's going to be an increase in the price of oil of $10 over the next 5 years, Mauricio. I need a number right now. Just tell me a number. This is not an exam. I'm asking you, what do you think is the probability of an increase in the price of oil of $10 over the next 5 years? 0, 1, what? 1. Ariel?
0.9.
Koshu?
0.8.
You see what I'm talking about, right? But let's, Grace, what do you think is the probability?
0.65.
Grace is not only different from you, she's bringing in the second decimal while we're doing the job on this. All right, so if you were what's called the Monetary Policy Committee of the Bank of England, these probabilities will be then combined into these confidence bands. Notice that it is not looking at the standard deviation of the history of oil prices. It's not doing that. It's assessing in your eyes what do you think is the probability. And the Bank of England, true to form, shows the Monetary Policy Committee probabilities. So there will be an Excel file with the probabilities for it. It's not really, it's not chopped liver, it's something else what those guys do. And so it is not that you're going to be looking at measures, statistical measures of uncertainty. They're going to be looking at, they're going to be thinking about it, and they're going to say, well, it's that, or it's not that. And so what it is doing is a move away from a statistical point estimate to subjective probabilities. It is subjective. This is from one of the first inflation reports. This is the original approach. So you have the evolution of the inflation rate. And so starting in 95, 96, they will go and compute, they will take the standard error of the model or the standard error of the inflation rate, and they will compute confidence bands. And so these are symmetrical by design. So the probability of being above this number is the same as the probability of being below that number. So they are symmetrical. And that's the thing that they did not like. Okay? This is the new approach. Let me make this. Let me make it a little bigger. Is it bigger or it's just flashing out? It's just flashing out. So notice that now you have the same inflation rate, but this band, the intensity of the color reflects probabilities, subjective probabilities. And so this inflation rate being between this and that has a very different subjective probability than between being here. The intensity of the color denotes the beliefs about where they think the inflation rate is going to be. But notice that they're not showing a line anymore. They're showing you areas. Part of it is that it goes like this. In here, this dashed line was viewed as the forecast of inflation by the Bank of England. And so people could just monitor the extent to which the actual inflation rate differed from the forecast inflation rate, and then give some points for accuracy in forecasting. And the problem that gave rise in the United Kingdom is that people were saying, well, but you forecasted this and turned out to be that. You're just not that good at this game. And so, if you want to say, well, what the guys in the Bank of England are just now trying to conceal their own ineptitude, that would be one thing. The important point is that there is a big distinction between forecasting and what we call conditional forecasting. Conditional forecasting is that if this set of assumptions were to materialize, then I anticipate the inflation rate being somewhere in this area. And I have a higher belief that it's going to be here than in there. But it is conditional in the sense that I need to make an assumption about economic activity. I need to make an assumption about exchange rate if I'm going to forecast. And I don't know if these assumptions are going to materialize. So from here on out, it's called conditional forecast in the sense that my forecast depends on assumptions. That distinction was too much for some people, especially in the British press. So you said that it was going to be 2.8. It is not 2.8. You blew it. Okay? And so that the Bank of England was saying in response, yeah, I know it's different, but it's because the assumptions that we made did not materialize. The European Union started, the Soviet Union collapsed, and none of those things were part of our initial forecast. So it's not all that surprising that our forecast is not what we said it was going to be. And so they have moved away from that. Okay, so here we go. This is the Bank of England's approach to reporting statistics. The name that they have for the inflation rate, this is a very specific measure of the inflation rate. It's what they call the RPIX. And there's more than one measure of inflation rate. In the United States, that we have the CPI, the core CPI, the price consumer, the expenditure deflator, the consumption expenditure deflator, with and without core. And so we have a collection of inflation rate. When they put RPIX, what they have in mind is a very specific measure of the inflation rate. And so think of this as the probability distribution of inflation at a particular date in the future. Okay? So the inflation rate could take the mode, could take the median, and so what is important here is not so much to be able to label the moments. What is important here is to know that it is not symmetric. Okay? So in this particular case, the probability of a higher inflation rate has what we call a greater mass, is more probable. Okay? Now, not all, there's nothing to say, there's nothing that compels the Bank of England to move to subjective probabilities just to have a asymmetrical distribution. Not all these distributions are symmetrical. You can have distributions that are not symmetrical, and they are still based on a sample. They chose this because they want to have control over their view. They don't want to work for the distribution. They want a distribution to work for them. Okay. Make sure that. No, fine. And so, how is the Bank of England generating this distribution? Well, they have models for the inflation rate that depend on the price of oil. They have models for the inflation rate that depend exchange rate. And you could ask, well, how come there isn't a model that depends on both? And the answer is there probably is a model that depends on both. I'm putting this dichotomy just to illustrate the dichotomy. You can imagine that if you were to have a measure of inflation rate, that there may be a better way of capturing the role of exchange rates into inflation than this model. So there's not gonna be a single model for everything. So they're gonna have models that are pretty good at capturing the pass-through of changes in the price of oil inflation, and they have models that are pretty good capturing the pass-through of the exchange rate to inflation. What they then do is to say, all right, it doesn't have to be the price of oil or the exchange rate. They could have other variables in here. Well, these two variables are really important for the United Kingdom. Okay, and so they're gonna say, we don't control the price of oil, but we want to measure the extent to which it's going to affect our outlook for the inflation. And so they will say, the price of oil is gonna go up and down, and we're going to get two effects. Delta sub A, if there's a decline in the price of oil, delta sub C, if there is an increase in the price of oil. And these two guys are not going to be the same. They're not the same. They're not the same with sign reversed. This could be -5 plus 2. And they're going to be shocking the exchange rate up and down, and they're going to get two effects on the inflation rate, minus delta B and delta D. So they care whether the inflation rate, the exchange rate is appreciating or depreciating. Then they go and construct this little table. I mean, their table is considerably more sophisticated than I have in here. So they have, in here there will be 4 scenarios: low price of oil, high price of oil, weaker exchange rate, strong exchange rate. These are the effects coming from the model. But then these probabilities are not statistical. This is what they think. What is the probability that that's good. What's the probability that there's going to be an increase in the price of oil of $10 over the next 5 years? 1, 0.9, 0.8, 0.69. So they're going to have to resolve this. So there's going to be a probability here. And there are going to be probabilities for the other guys as well. Then, okay, so I'm sorry, there's something about the particular format that I'm using that it shows the answer and then start asking questions. So how do they get their forecast? They begin with what they believe to be the most likely inflation forecast, what they call in the absence of shock. Then they're going to consider alternative developments and their implications for inflation. That's what we just did. And they're going to attach probabilities to each scenario. So that's what we're doing here. From this, they get this. They get this particular probability distribution. So in each of these dashed lines shows the edge of a band, and they go into some length into the text to explain that. But notice that they are attaching a fairly large probability that the inflation rate will exceed 5%, and that probability is different from this. And the central tendency, the mode is the one that they attach the highest intensity of color. And so think of this as the probability distribution of inflation as a result of starting with a forecast in the absence of shocks, take the shocks, then attach probabilities to them, and then generate this. And there's going to be one of these for each period. Here's how it looks. And so now you have the probability distribution at each period. And this is what they show. Now, forget whether the Bank of England is effective or not. I mean, these are excellent charts. Don't you think? I mean, you see this, and the country could be going to hell in a handbasket next week. But I want to keep seeing this, right? These are just stunning charts. All right. Pete.
Can you go back one more?
Yeah.
So if we thought of these like these little bands as the sort of A, B, C's, and D's from the previous table.
Yeah.
Okay.
But for a given period.
Right.
So the guys in the Monetary Policy Committee in the United Kingdom, in the Bank of England, are gonna say, well, that's for this quarter, for the next quarter, have a different set of probabilities. And so, it's not that, they're not hand waving the exercise, they're, they go and sit and. Now, here comes the trick. There is a tension. There's a tension for circularity in reason. Because when the Bank of England is going to forecast the inflation rate, they need to use the interest rate. Because the interest rate affects the exchange rate, and the exchange rate affects inflation. So they need to make an assumption about the interest rate to forecast the economy. The circularity is that forecast is what then is in principle going to be used to determine the interest rate that they assume in the first place. You see the circularity. In order to forecast, I need to input forecast values for the interest rate. And then the question that arises is, how is it possible then that I'm gonna turn around and use those forecasts to determine the interest rate that I just used? Okay? So they have a couple of neat tricks to do this. The first approach is that they assume that the interest rate is constant. And so if they were doing this today, they would take the last historical value of the interest rate and assume that the interest rate is going to remain constant for the foreseeable future. So they're not changing the interest rate. Okay? So they break the circularity right there. The second approach is to use what's called market-based expectations for the interest rate. And so they go, I mean, the Federal Reserve does this, so effectively there's a futures market for the federal funds rate, which records the people's expectation about the federal funds rate in the future. So you can use that. I am not so sure that this circumvents the problem, because if this future market is anticipating what the Federal Reserve is going to do, or what the Bank of England is going to do, and then you use what they're anticipating you to use, well then we'll introduce a circularity, except that the circle is a little bigger, but nevertheless, they are outside the control of the Bank of England. It's not that the Bank of England is using the interest rate to generate the forecast that they like the best, and therefore that's the interest rate that they're going to use. So those are the two ways in which they circumvent that problem. Here comes the big problems with, at least from my standpoint, over the inflation target. When you say that you're an inflation targeter, you're in effect saying that you don't care about output, that you don't care about unemployment. If you are now caring about unemployment or about output, you may be a very reasonable central bank. And that's just, you're not crazy, and for all I know, that's the thing to do. But then it gets tricky to declare yourself as an inflation targeter, because you're not. Okay? And here is what the bank, incidentally, these are the charts from one of the earlier inflation reports. You can see the new ones are just, I mean, if you like this, you gotta check the new ones. They're just that much better. And so here it is, the confidence band, subjective confidence band for GDP growth. And so if you start taking these results into account for setting monetary policy, then you're not an inflation target. That's nothing bad with it, but you're just not an inflation target. There is right now a fair amount of work that seeks to establish that the use of the term inflation targeting is something akin to a hoax. It's a delusion. It's something that we're the best, or that, you know, that type of one sentence thing that you think summarizes everything that there is to summarize. Benjamin Friedman has a very nasty paper, it's in the reference, has a very nasty paper on this. My recollection of his argument is that if a central bank declares itself not to be inflation targeter, then it automatically loses credibility. Whether it follows the principles of inflation targeting or not is now not of the essence. What is of the essence is what is the flag that you're raising. And if you put pi in there and nothing but pi, then you're credible. But if you put pi and comma u, oh, we don't know, right? And so it's a quick way for the central bank to declare, to gain, if you want, credibility. It's a very cynical and critical paper of two things. First, central banks that practice this, and second, the profession that somehow chooses to ignore that they're playing with words and they're doing nothing real. There's more music. Suppose there is a gap between the actual inflation rate and the target inflation rate. All right, so the question that arises is, how long would it take to go back to the target? Mauricio, what's your recollection of the Bank of Mexico? You said,
Oh, I just checked and it's 3 in, what, lost in language.
yeah, but do they say, I'm sorry, so what is the target rate?
3, but they have this band, like get 4 to 2.
So it goes from 4 to 2?
Yeah.
So Mauricio's checking the Bank of Mexico, and their target rate, okay, not confidence bank crap, target is between 4 and 2. So long as the inflation rate oscillates between those bounds, things are fine. Now then you have to tag confidence bands to this range. So, all right. Do they indicate, or are you aware of how long do they say will take to go back to, in the event that there's a gap, how long does it take to get back to the target, do they say?
I'm not sure because they changed it from when the 2009 crisis, they started changing it, and from 2011, I think, they went back to 3.
No, not so much the target, the amount of time that they promise to return to target, the delay between the gap, and do they say something else? Precisely the point, that if central banks do not tell you how long it's gonna take, then in what sense are you an inflation target? Now, this wouldn't be a big deal if inflation targeting wasn't about communication between the central bank and the public. So it has to be more than saying there's a target, we are out of it, and we will get there eventually. We'll call you. It has to be more than that. And if they don't tell you, well, then you're dangling. So that's one. The other consideration that is really important is that how they get there matters. So how long does it take? How do we get there? You can imagine that one central bank may say, well, we're just gonna go gradual about the whole thing, and so they start taking policies that take you, this is the initial gap, they take you gradually there. So that's one approach, right? But another approach is says, we tank and then resurface. So I'm gonna take monetary policy so severe that I'm gonna bring the inflation rate below the target, and then we'll go back to the target rate. Now, they don't tell you which method they're gonna use. And so, once again, you're tanking. Okay? And that's all I got for today. Oh, no, I'm sorry, no, that's not a little more music. Not much, but. Okay. Return. Let's go return. Okay. May take 20 minutes for me to get back to where I want to. do is to talk a little about communications. This is perhaps one of the most important subjects in macroeconomic policy, especially monetary policy. And the reason why I think it's so important is because it is how central banks tell the private sector what's the current situation in the economy and what they intend to do. In the United States, yesterday was the meeting of the Federal Open Market Committee. Right after that meeting ends, they have this press release. The structure, we're not gonna go over it just now. The structure of this press release is preset, and the presetting was set by the central bank. So they begin, by telling us what has happened up to that point. So the first paragraph is summary of economic activity. Second paragraph is, given that we have to do something by law, we're going to translate those developments in economic activity into policy actions to attain the goals. And so here it says, the committee expects that with appropriate policy accommodation, economic activity will expand at a moderate pace, with labor market indicators and inflation moving toward levels the committee judges, check, that's not an accidental word there, right? Judges, it is their judgment, with its dual mandate. Then they're gonna tell us something about the risks. The risks to the outlook for economic activity and the labor market are as nearly balanced. What that means is that the chances of being above and the chances of being below are about the same. And the likelihood of inflation running persistently below 2% has diminished somewhat. So this is what David, this is what I was saying, that if we were above 2%, that sentence would be there. Okay. Now they're not telling you what inflation rate they're using. Right. Then the third paragraph is about what they're going to do. This is going to play a big role in the segment that follows the communication, which is the unconventional monetary policy. And then I want you to check this, the last. So the last bit is about the voting. So they vote to do something, and then they list who voted in favor and who voted against. Everybody voted in favor against Plauser, who, and they know in here, who objected to guidance indicating that it likely will be appropriate to maintain the current target range for the federal funds rate for a considerable time after the asset purchase program ends. Note that the objection here is about the choice of words. Had the words been different, he may have not objected. And so the choice of words is in effect reflecting the stance of monetary policy. And the stance of monetary policy in this particular release says that they're going to keep the interest rate for a considerable time. Talk about ambiguities, a considerable time after the asset purchases end. And he didn't like that. And then he didn't like that because such language is time dependent, clearly, right? If it's considerable time, it's gotta be time dependent, and does not reflect the considerable economic progress that has been made towards the committee's goals. I want now for somebody to reinterpret that last clause in terms of U star and UA. In other words, he seems to be thinking that the U star, for some of the members of the committee, is above the natural rate, where he thinks that he's a little closer to the natural rate. Right? Notice that in that simple idiotic clause, there is a world of analysis that has to do with the Federal Reserve perception of how close we are with full employment. In other words, they have different views on our proximity to full employment, which is inherent. Right about now, the poll papers calls us again. How do you know what full employment is? By my calculation, that number has changed. It is not a fixed number parked in the heavens. It's a number that has changed. So how do you know? And most of the time the answer to this is, I don't know. But then if you don't know, what alternatives may you be willing to entertain? What I'm trying to convey to you now is how the stuff that we have been doing enables you to understand monetary policy as currently implemented in the United States and to disagree with it, to form your own view, to be critical of it, and to be able to articulate reasons why your views may differ. That's what we have done. Now, the question that arises, and that's what we're going to do next time, or begin to do next time, is who the hell designed this? I mean, this sort of thing is new, not 2 years new. It's relatively new. How was this designed? What issues went into consideration into the design? What were the advantages? What were the disadvantages? Monetary policy is about managing expectations. And that's what these guys are trying to do, is to manage expectations. Okay, good. So we will be talking next Tuesday. And the assignment, which is, I hope it's not a big deal, will be for next 17th. Feel free to assemble the one page and send me the PDF, okay?
That's kind of cool.
To write the first part of
Nice.